The Chargers had their first big loss on the coaching staff last week when safeties coach Chris O'Leary left for greener pastures, but the good news is the Chargers found a new man for the jobs, and he seems very qualified for the position.
You are Locked On Chargers, your daily podcast on the Los Angeles Chargers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is up, and welcome into the Locked On Chargers podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Wade, joined as always by my co-host, David Droegemeier, and we've been covering the Chargers now for 9 seasons together, but this is our 7th year as the host of the Locked On Chargers podcast, bringing you your team every day. Thank you to the everydayers out there for making us your first listen. To make sure that you never miss the show, go subscribe or follow for free on the Locked On Chargers YouTube channel and listen wherever you get your podcast from. David, what do we got today?
Well, it was sad to see Chris O'Leary go and get another opportunity to get back to the college ranks as a defensive coordinator. And so that left a vacancy. And so the Chargers went back into the college ranks and filled that vacancy with Adam Fuller, who has been a defensive coordinator for multiple different stops and brings a lot of experience to the safety coach position here for the Chargers. And then we're going to talk about what it's going to take for the Chargers to build a Super Bowl contender, what the moves they need to make on offense and defense to make sure that they push that team over the top.
Yeah, a lot to get into, and there's definitely a way this Chargers roster, where it stands right now, can make the right additions to becoming a contender in 2025 and beyond. But crossover Thursdays are every Thursday, and today is presented by PrizePicks. Download the app and use code LOCKEDONNFL to win $50 instantly when you play $5. And David, we haven't gotten a ton of news, but we did get some good news today that the Chargers had filled the really only vacancy on their coaching staff, which surprisingly has had less coaches, I think, poached than maybe we would have expected. It started with Jesse Minter staying put, which is great. But the Chargers defensive coaching staff did lose a big piece last week. I mean, we talked about it when they lost him. I mean, Chris O'Leary did a really good job with the Chargers safety group. It was one of the more impressive positions on the team when you think about the loss of Alohi Gilman, how many different players they cycled through that position, and still being able to be as connected and productive as their safety group was, the better safety group we've seen over the last several seasons. But according to Pete Thamel, the Chargers are set to hire former Florida State DC Adam Fuller as the team's new safeties coach. He's a veteran college defensive coordinator with stops at FSU, Memphis, and Marshall. So FSU, you always think, Derwin James came from there. Obviously, Asante Samuel Jr. came from there. But this is someone, David, that has a ton of experience. I mean, multiple different stops as a defensive coordinator. And the Chargers continuing to pick from the collegiate ranks, which I think is interesting, and we'll talk to a little bit. But I think this guy has a pretty impressive resume to bring to the Chargers, and seems like he was kind of scapegoated on a FSU team that totally imploded in 2024. I think we'll bring a lot of really quality experience to the staff.
Well, yeah, and you can't always look at that year production and put a label on what this guy's been able to produce, because just looking at some of the players that have come out of that program from 2020 to 2024, some really, really good names, especially here in the 2024 draft, where it's Jared Verse and Braden Fisk, who two guys that just absolutely went crazy with the Rams and helped them win a division championship and ultimately a playoff game as well. I mean, they were very, very impactful in that game. Then it's Tatum Bethune, a linebacker, Jermaine Johnson, a first round pick in 2022. Obviously Asante Samuel Jr. and we'll talk about Janarius Robinson, and then Hamza Nasruddin, all players that came from FSU while Adam Fuller was the defensive coordinator there. So he's had some success translating the game of football from the college ranks to the NFL ranks, and got some very, very good NFL players out of it.
Yeah, and a lot of defensive players. If you're looking at the players who got drafted from Florida State since 2020 when he took over as their defensive coordinator, almost exclusively defensive players that have been drafted from Florida State, which is in total 11 defensive players over 4 seasons, because he'll have another one or maybe a couple of them drafted in this upcoming draft as well, which he coached this season. Those players getting drafted in 2025, including Azareye'h Thomas, which is a dude who just tore up the Senior Bowl. You'd have to think the Chargers might be a little bit more interested in him now that they have some background with his former coach and a guy who coached him for several seasons. But 5 defensive backs that he put in the NFL over those 4 drafts since he took over, and then he'll probably have another one this year. But I do think that when you look at just what he was able to do overall in college, over 25 years of experience at the collegiate level, you're talking about a guy who's coached 29 All-Americans and had 84 players who were named All-Conference that he specifically coached. He did have a really bad season with FSU this year. Their whole team was bad, but top 23 in the country of 150 plus teams in 2022 and 2023. So recency bias got him fired, but there is a lot I think to like here. And I also think another big part of this too is a former player himself, which is something that's a real theme on the Chargers coaching staff too. Not only did most of the Chargers defensive coaching staff come from the NCAA level, but there's also a lot of experience. And this is a dude who was a 2-time FCS All-American at the Sacred Heart College. So a guy that has some experience, and probably a guy, David, that has some relationship with Derwin James, who is still very linked in that Florida State program. And it also makes me wonder kind of how if any way it changes how they feel about Asante Samuel Jr., because now they're getting one of the coaches, even if he's a safety coach, a guy who obviously coached him at Florida State.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely, one of the connections that you pay attention to when you're considering Adam Fuller being, the new safeties coach, obviously bringing, his expertise to this coaching staff. And, Asante was a big time player at Florida State for sure. Like he made a lot of plays, and he was able to successfully translate, his last name to, a pretty good, draft pick and a, pretty good first contract in the league. Obviously dealt with some ups and downs. Had a fantastic playoff game that's still talked about to this day. But unfortunately, who knows where the Chargers are going to be looking at with Asante Samuel Jr., as in, he's going to be a free agent going into this season. And who knows, after, a injury shortened season, if they're going to want to bring him back. But, you always look for these connections and look for places to try to, draw some parallels, and obviously having, one of your best players, as an alumni from Florida State, with Derwin James, that's something you're always going to pay attention to. And, this guy is always wanting to know what's going on with Florida State. So I'm sure he knows exactly who this guy is and what he brings to the table.
Absolutely, and I think it's interesting as well because safety is kind of a low-key need for the Chargers. Maybe not enough people are talking about, because right now, really, the only 2 players you have returning at that position are Derwin James and Alohi Gilman. That's it. And you have Alohi Gilman coming off a pretty significant injury that kept him out a good amount in 2024. That's a room that needs some more bodies in it. And yes, you should re-sign Elijah Molden. He was awesome for you last year. Yep. You should potentially re-sign Tony Jefferson for depth, who was great when he was called on last year. At the same time, it does feel like that's a room that kind of needs a youth infusion into it, because, Alohi going into last year of his contract, Derwin James obviously is a stalwart player that you expect to get several years from, but also he's a dude that played a ton in the slot. And one of the reasons is because they had guys behind him that they trusted. So this is kind of an area where this new coach, right, Adam Fuller, might have to coach some guys up, because it might be some young blood in that room.
And they need that. They really do. As far as, the safety position, the cornerback position, those are groups, position groups that really see a lot of injuries. And so you want to make sure that you have enough bodies to be able to sustain through the season. And, those are positions that I think you should always be looking at trying to address in the draft, because you get those players on cost-controlled contracts. And, hey, if you're able to find one later in the draft that hits, then that's kind of like finding gold.
Yeah, and I hope that the loss of Chris O'Leary doesn't hurt their chances of bringing back Elijah Molden, because what O'Leary did with Elijah Molden and Tony Jefferson and Marcus May and, everyone they brought in, like, those are big shoes to fill, and you have to hope that Adam Fuller it can kind of step in where that group left off, which was a group that did such a better job not giving up explosive plays, such a good job being connected on the back end, no matter who they had to put out there. I mean, at one point, like Kendall Williamson is getting snaps out there, and they still found a way to make it work, and it never just seemed like they had glaring, obvious issues on the back end, which was such a refreshing sight after how often we saw it during the Brandon Staley era. So some room needed, some work needed in that room for sure. One of the main, or, one of the several moves or position groups that the Chargers will have to improve if they want to become contenders in 2025. And it might seem far away because of how the playoffs ended, But David, there is a roadmap. There is a game plan that this team can take to get them into contender status in 2025 and beyond. And we're going to lay it out for you and more in today's Locked On Chargers podcast. Super Bowl 59 is here. One game, two teams, endless possibilities, and there's no better way to make every play more exciting than when FanDuel Sportsbook. Whether it's predicting the first touchdown, calling the MVP, or even betting on the coin toss. How could you not bet on the coin toss? Just a little juice to get you started at the very beginning. I love prop bets. I love the Super Bowl. And my favorite part is all of the crazy bets you can get on it. And I love that FanDuel has so many great options. And FanDuel also makes it easy to get in on the action with live betting all game long. You can adjust your bets as the game unfolds and feel the thrill from the kickoff to the final whistle. And that's so nice because it can be so defeating. What if all you bet on was the coin toss and then you lose that right off the bat? You can get a feel for the game. You can see how things are going and have live in-game betting. And that feature lets you stay involved no matter what happens on the field. And the app is super easy to navigate. Plus, knowing that you can place a $5 bet and potentially win $200 in bonus bets for the Super Bowl, that's icing on the cake. All you have to do, download the app or head to FanDuel.com to get started. Bet just $5, and if you win, you'll score $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com. Bet with FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the NFL and Super Bowl 59. David, this is something we wanted to bring up, especially with the Super Bowl going down on Sunday, and it's go Birds all the way because I have to see the Chiefs three-peat broken up. It's going to make me absolutely sick if the Chiefs are able to pull it off. I'm looking at every single Eagles FanDuel bet and going all of that direction, even though it might make more sense for me to bet on the Chiefs, right? Just because as an emotional hedge, if they win, at least I'll win money. Can't do it. I just won't do it. It's a principle matter. I can't put anything on the Chiefs at all. But what the Super Bowl kind of made me think of, David, was just what did the Chargers have to do to become a true Super Bowl contender? Because we didn't think they were going into last season, but this is year 2 now. It's not year 1. You're not dealing with the same circumstances that you were when this new regime took over. $45 million over the cap. Huge albatross contracts of aging players that had to be dealt with, and they couldn't be dealt with without just taking huge losses on both or just one side of the ball. But at the same time, after an 11-6 season, the way they were kind of able to put this patchwork roster together, I think there's a lot of good that you can retain and a lot of places that you can improve that could launch them into being from being a playoff team to a contending team. And it's so hard to do right now in the AFC. They basically have to pull off a flawless offseason. That just is what it is. If you want to catch the teams that are ahead of you, the Ravens and the Bills and the Chiefs, and you want to knock those teams out and multiple of them on your way to the Super Bowl, you need to make a lot of improvements. And I think it starts with fixing the offense. The Chargers offense disappeared too often, and building a contender starts with fixing its obvious flaws. Major improvements needed at multiple spots. And Greg Roman isn't going anywhere, but they can give him a whole lot more to work with. And I think when you're talking about number one, kind of in bright letters, what this team needs, David, there's one or two places you could go with. But I think if we're talking about how the Chargers turn into contenders in 2025, it starts with adding 2 premier weapons on offense.
It absolutely does. I mean, you look at the two teams that are in the Super Bowl, they have multiple weapons. It's A.J. Brown, Devontae Smith, Dallas Goedert, Saquon Barkley, obviously, an all-world running back who just went crazy, 2,000 rushing yards plus, including the playoffs, like just unreal. And then obviously with the Chiefs, with Travis Kelce and Xavier Worthy, DeAndre Hopkins to a lesser degree, but they have multiple different pieces on offense that can hurt you. It's not just one guy. And, at times for the Chargers throughout this season, the one guy that you can consistently count on that you had to worry about wrecking a game was Ladd McConkey. And if you had a good defense that had the ability to really shut down anyone else that, was a receiving option that couldn't beat man-to-man like Ladd McConkey could, then the Chargers offense was in a lot of trouble. So fixing that problem and adding another partner in crime for Ladd McConkey to help him and help this offense is definitely among tops of the list for the Chargers to address this offseason.
Yeah, the offense just needs more juice, man, and there's definitely several ways they could go about it, but ideally you can find an impact outside receiver and also upgrade at the receiving tight end position. In a perfect world, you trade for a DK Metcalf and you draft a Tyler Warren or a Colson Loveland. That's the kind of moves I think would go a long ways towards making this a legitimate offense that isn't so easy to slow down once playoff time comes. Like, you can't go into next season with Quentin Johnson being your wide receiver too. You just can't. I don't think you can go into next season with Will Dissly being your top receiving option at tight end. You just can't. Both of those guys can have roles, but you need to push them down the pecking order and who the focal points of this offense are. And it starts with adding more juice to those positions. And I also think it could be getting more juice at running back too. Strong running back class this year. We'll see what happens with J.K. Dobbins. But I think either way, even if you can't retain even if you do retain J.K. Dobbins, this is a class you want to take a running back. But the other thing you'll find is, as far as commonalities in these two Super Bowl teams, David, and a lot of the best teams in the playoffs, elite offensive lines and elite on the interior of the offensive line. So that's why the next part, as far as coming to grips with what it will take to actually make this Chargers team a contender, to me, the bare minimum and to get them to contender status is upgrading 2 out of 3 of the interior offensive line spots. It doesn't have to be perfect, but I need at least 2/3 of that unit replaced and improved upon.
Yeah, and the Chargers had said, hey, that they want Bradley Bozeman back, and if it's as a depth piece, then that's definitely something that I would be interested in, a player that was very durable, that played a ton of snaps. Yeah. But the fact of the matter is, if you're going to look at it objectively and you're going to evaluate the performance of the offensive line, it is very clear where you need to attack improvements on that side of the football and that specific part of the team, the spine of your team. It has to be strengthened in the middle of your offensive line. You love what you have on the outsides with Rashawn Slater and Joe Alt, fantastic players. But they don't have anybody on the inside that is a elite or close to elite type player. So if they want to be where the Eagles and the Chiefs are, they need to have at least 1 or 2 elite players in the middle to match who they have on the outsides, because you just can't have one specific area that is so easy to exploit and really, peck at and really try to destroy if you want to win football games. You have to mitigate your weaknesses, and obviously the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. You can't roll that same interior offensive line out there and expect a different result. It's just absolutely impossible to do. So they have to go out there, whether it's in free agency or in the draft. It has to be addressed, and it can't be addressed modestly. It needs to be addressed emphatically.
Yeah, I'd feel a lot better about it if they went and spent a bag and got a legitimate, improvement in free agency and made that, one of, if not their top priority in free agency, and just secure one, whether it's top center, whether it's a top guard, and secure one that is going to play at an above average level, or at least has to that point in their career. Because you look at the Chiefs, the Eagles, great lines, 2 of the best lines in football. So do the Lions, so do the Bucks, so do the Bills. That's what the best teams have, and that is where you're far away from. You don't even need elite players, in my opinion, but you just can't have the worst group in the league. Like, you have to have average to above average players at 2 or 3 of those spots, and maybe you don't have to replace Zion Johnson and Bradley Bozeman and Trey Pipkins, but all of those guys, whoever returns, has to have major competition to say the least. But I think the other big thing the Chargers have to do is really ace what they do with their internal free agents. And for me, it kind of looks like this. Re-signing these 5 free agents, I think, is at the top of my list of making the Chargers contenders. Keep who worked, right? Khalil Mack, Poona Ford, J.K. Dobbins, Tier Tart, and Elijah Molden. That would be my 5 right there as far as keeping the Chargers or making them contenders. It starts with securing the guys that made you really successful this year and adding on to it. If they fit in for depth reasons, Tony Jefferson, Troy Dye, Christian Fulton, Bradley Bozeman, good with all those things. Not to start, right? But good with all of those depth pieces, because the depth is the other thing that really helped the Chargers this year and kept them afloat. And then it also has to do with making necessary cuts, David, and opening up as much cap space as you possibly can right now. That starts with Joey Bosa, Trey Pipkins, and Gus Edwards. That's the trio I'm looking at. It's no offense to any of them. The Chargers need upgrades on all of those positions over what they got in 2024. And just those 3 moves are going to open close to $35 million in cap space, giving the Chargers up to $98 million in cap space. So keeping those guys, releasing those guys, that's what I think has to happen for the Chargers to keep kind of the nucleus intact here of what they had that went right for them so they can add on to that and become contenders and take that leap.
I mean, it's real simple. Cut the bad, keep the good, and keep it rolling, and add on to what you had from that group. I mean, that's just really as simple as it is. I co-sign with all of those moves.
It just feels like, hey, you hit on a lot of them and you didn't hit on some because you had to really kind of roll the dice on a lot of one-year contracts and minimum deals. But I don't know if any of those guys are going to cost through the roof, right?
No.
I mean, Khalil Mack is definitely going to cost a pretty penny, and he's worth bringing back at whatever the price tag is, for, to within reason, obviously. But I think if you can keep those 5 core guys, add on to that, bring a couple more guys back for depth, and then improve on kind of the misses you had, like a Gus Edwards, right? Like a Hayden Hurst, like some of these other options they brought in that didn't work out, you'll be in business and you'll be a lot closer. But there's a lot more that has to happen too, because the defense was awesome. Now you have to do it again. You have to run it back and maintain it. And I think there are even several spots where the Chargers could improve, but that'll be a big part in them contending in 2025. And we'll get into all that and more in today's Locked On Chargers podcast. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. What do you want your 2025 story to be? Every January brings in a new chapter, 365 blank pages waiting for you to fill. If there's part of your life you want to rewrite or a plot twist you've been craving, why wait? Life isn't about fleeting resolutions. It's about taking control and becoming the author of your own story. Think of therapy as your personal editor helping you craft the life you deserve. It's not just for crisis situations. Therapy can help you develop healthier coping strategies, improve your relationships, and empower you to be the best version of yourself. Whether you're facing a challenge or just looking for personal growth, therapy is a powerful tool to help guide your journey. Whether it's learning how to set boundaries or tackling stress in new ways, therapy can help you develop skills for a better tomorrow. Even if you've never tried therapy, the benefits are clear. Finding someone to talk to and gaining fresh perspectives can make all the difference in how you navigate life's ups and downs. Write your story with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/lockedon today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. David, well, let's continue building the Chargers into the Super Bowl contender that we want to see. And I mean, a big part of it is fixing the offense, because that was the biggest flaw on this team in 2024. Oh, yeah. And Justin Herbert needs more help. And all the things we talked about, right, not only helps Justin Herbert, but it helps give him a running game and helps kind of just make it a more balanced offense. But the defense is a different story, because the defense was great, right? They were really, really good. And now it's about maintaining it. Now it's about revamping it, rebuilding it, recreating what made them so successful in 2024. But thank you, as always, for making us your first listen. To make sure you never miss the show, go subscribe or follow for free on the Locked On Chargers YouTube channel and listen wherever you get your podcast from. And also on our social media, where you can hit us up tomorrow, because tomorrow is Fan Mail Friday. So hit us up at Locked On LAC or call into the voicemail line at 323-524-7924. And thank you, as always, for making us your first listen. If you need a second listen, make sure to check out the new slate at Locked On NFL, where they have Tyler the Madman rolling with his own show and my guy Tony Wiggins in the barbershop on YouTube and wherever you get your podcast from. David, the offensive side of things was about fixing the offense. But if you look at the defense, you don't really have to fix it. There's not as many kind of key things that you have to fix. Yet I look at it and I say, although they were the best scoring defense in the league last year, some of that came from, a lot of it came from beating up on bad teams. There's some obvious places that they have to improve, or where they could actually improve this. But now it's about maintaining what was a top 5 defense for you last season.
Yes, it is. And so, yeah, you know that you have a strong nucleus of players pretty much at every level of the defense, right? You have guys that are both really good players right now, and you have players that really you could see potential growing into really, really good players. So looking at, your defensive line, obviously, you had great success with Poona Ford and Tierra Tart. Those guys rotated in and they were fantastic, especially against the run. Poona Ford was phenomenal. And then in the middle, you have obviously the guy that we had on the show yesterday, Deion Henley, who was a breakout candidate. Absolutely just went crazy, stuffed the stat sheet, doing it all with a, messed up shoulder as well. And then, of course, on the back end with Derwin James. So you have pieces at every level that you feel really good about building around, but now it's about adding the pieces to make them even more effective.
Well, and I think when you look at it, David, I mean, there's a lot of that's up in the air. I mean, obviously, we just talked about who we would bring back. But that's like half the defense, right? Like
Yeah.
that you're hoping you can bring back. I mean, you're talking about two new starting defensive tackles if you can't bring back those two guys, Apuna Ford and T.A. are both going into free agency. Morgan Fox also heading into free agency. You have no idea what's going to happen with Khalil Mack, but if you count him and Joey Bosa, obviously you have Tuli to step into one of those roles. But that's two more spots that are uncertain going into 2025. Christian Fulton started a lot of games for you last year. Elijah Molden started a lot of games for you last year. Denzel Perriman started for you last year, right?
Yeah.
3, 5, 7, 7 potential starting spots that you have to either fill back with the guys that you had or find somebody new to take that role. Now, you're not going to lose all those guys, I feel confident in saying, especially when you have the amount of money that the Chargers have right now. Like, you should be able to keep which of those guys you want. But I think it's about revamping and kind of recreating it. And I think it starts with building a dominant front, right?
Yeah.
Khalil Mack going into free agency, obviously. You have to start with bringing back Poona Ford and Khalil Mack, but it can't stop there. Defensive tackle, an underrated need for this team. And at the edge rusher room, like, you need more there too. Like, I don't trust Bud Dupree. Like, obviously, Tuli Tuipulotu has a lot of parts of his game that have to get polished. You need to add more talent to both of those positions. I mean, you look at what the Rams did trying to replace Aaron Donald. They took Jared Verse and Braden Fisk back to back, and then had one of the most dominant fronts in the entire NFL. And
let's say it worked.
Playoff teams, you see a lot of dominant fronts there. So I think building a dominant front is one of the best ways the Chargers can maintain being one of the top defenses in the NFL, and also to keep them being contenders going into next season, or actually make them contenders.
It's definitely a spot that I want to see an infusion of talent. Is the interior of the defensive line. Guys that are really kind of dominant football players. I mean, it's been a very, very long time since the Chargers have had a really truly dominant interior defensive lineman. They've had some good players. They've had some good rotational players, but they haven't had a guy that has been able to take over a football game and change the trajectory of a game from the interior of their defensive line since probably Jamal Williams. So it's been a problem that they haven't been able to solve for a very, very long time. And if they want to get to being a Super Bowl contender, and they want to beat the good teams that are on their schedule, then they need to have an impact guy in the middle.
Well, I think this is the hard thing, right? I don't trust any of the defensive tackles that are going to be left on this roster in 2025. And yeah, you hope that those players can improve, and I definitely do. But like, I can't trust Tito Abonia or Scott Matlock or Justin Aboybe right now to be the answers in 2025 and think that's going to be an improved unit. I think you need to bring back Apuna Ford, you need to bring back Tier Tart, and you need to add to it. And it's supposed to be a very good defensive tackle draft. If you can add a guy with some legitimate pass rush chops, because that wasn't really those guys' games, and they're all rotational players, so there's room for more besides just the two guys you need to bring back. And the edge rusher position, adding some juice there, moving on from Joey Bosa is probably going to happen. You need to add more juice. And I think also, David, another thing is I'd feel a lot better going into 2025 maintaining what they did this year if they added another starting level corner.
Oh, 100%. I mean, Christian Fulton played a ton of snaps for the Chargers and started, for a large portion, and was given the opportunity to start from pretty much the moment that he was signed. They brought him and said, hey, we're going to be able to rebuild your value. You're going to be the starter here. And for the first part of the season, he played very, very well. But towards the end of the season, he gave up a lot of really big, explosive plays, and it started to become a pattern. And so I think it's definitely something where they need to bring somebody in, to replace that, whether it's in free agency or the draft, and hey, Joe Ortiz said that they're always going to be looking for corners. Well, they need to keep that keen eye. They did a great job in the draft grabbing a couple, and they're going to have to add even more.
Yeah, right now you're looking at Cam Hart, Tarheeb Still, Dean Leonard, and Josh Taylor as the guys that are coming back. At this point, you can really only feel confident that those last two guys, Ja and Dean Leonard, are going to be special teams players, even though I'm always bullish on Dean Leonard, and I will be until he's 7 years retired. But you also have Derwin James as part of that factors in, too, because he played 385 slot snaps and was an all-pro slot cornerback, according to the AP this year. So Tarheeb still has the flexibility to play inside or out. You want one more guy there for depth. for just raising kind of the ceiling for what that group can be. If you got one more starting corner, you don't have to really pick one or the other because you have some flexibility at that spot already. It make me feel a lot better about them being contenders in 2025. But I think the other big part, just a more general theme, is just you're going to have to get more impact players out of the draft. One of the only reasons the Chargers were so much better this year was because you had 4 starters that you got out of the draft, including 2 you got on day 3 in round 5 with Cam Hart and Tarheeb Still. Joe Ortiz, really in free agency and the draft, David, like that is a non-negotiable if this team is going to become contenders. Chef Ortiz has to show up again and really nail some of these bigger free agent signings that are definitely coming down the pike. And also, if you can find 4 more starters in this next rookie draft class, you're going to be way, way closer than to contention and really speed up the timeline.
Yeah, it's one thing to do, really, really well when you kind of have to bargain bin shop. It's another thing when you have all the resources available to you and then making the right decisions and being prudent with those decisions with the money that you have available. That's a completely different thing. And then, you did a great job of finding impact in your first draft, and not just in the beginning of the draft, but also towards the end of the draft. We're going to have to see that consistency again if we want to see the Chargers in the Super Bowl next season.
Yeah, and they have 10 picks. So, I mean, you're hoping to hit on at least 4 that can contribute in year 1 and maybe some more that can develop down the road. And I think another part of it is, hey, if you have your guys and you're trusting your scouting process and all of those things, move around if you have to, because you have compensatory picks on day 3. You have some ammunition to move around. If you feel strongly about a guy you think can come contribute, you want to, move back into the second round because maybe that's where the draft kind of starts to tail off. You want to move up in the second round to secure a player you think can start for you. Fire away, right? Because if you can do that in this draft class, you're like, if the Chargers want to be contenders and have a realistic shot at the Super Bowl in 2025, Joe Ortiz has to ace this offseason. There's just no other way around it. He has to be able to bring back the guys who played well, but also find better deals. Because, you're right. No one cares that you missed on Hayden Hurst because it was a 1-year deal on like the minimum, right? No one cares that you missed on Gus Edwards or these guys because they were very low risk, kind of high reward signings. No one's going to hold that against you. You have a J.C. Jackson, you get a Brian Bulaga, you get one of these guys that just doesn't show up or, can't stay on the field, whatever the case is, then it starts looking a little worse.
Yeah, those stains don't wash away.
And you have to trust that he can get it done because of how good he was, picking the players that he did and finding the right fits for this team last year. And he has to do it again if the Chargers actually want to contend for something special in 2025. But that's going to wrap things up for today's show. The good news is tomorrow you can tell us what you want to hear about because it's Fan Mail Friday. And if you haven't already, go check out the Dayon Henley interview from yesterday because it was awesome. The best interview that we've ever done. But also tell us what you want to talk about tomorrow by hitting us up at Locked On LAC and giving us your question there, calling into the voicemail line at 323-524-7924 or hitting us at any of our social media, me at Dan Talk Sports and David at Dro Talk SD on Twitter, on Instagram at Locked On Chargers, or our Locked On Chargers Facebook page. We love to hear what you guys want to talk about, and we love Fan Mail Friday and getting you guys involved in the show as much as we possibly can. But this is the only daily Chargers podcast out there, and we appreciate the everydayers for sticking with us through this offseason, and we will continue to try to bring on great guests and give you guys our best offseason content yet. But make sure you guys are back here tomorrow for Fan Mail Friday. But until then, guys, take it easy and go Bolts.